I said I was going to do every 10 books. So I talk about the last 10 books that I read. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I realized that 10 books might be stretching the length of the video a little bit further than I want. So what we're going to do is every 7 books. So this stack here is the last 7 books that I read. And these are the books we're going to talk about. So let's jump into it. First up, we have one pretty much everyone out there has heard of. I'd heard about it for years, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. It's good. The hesitation in my voice is because almost every idea in this book has been taken and used by somebody else in their own context. So while in 1936, this might have been fairly revolutionary, it doesn't get that credit anymore just because we've heard it all before. Even though this is the source and this is who should be getting the credit, doesn't mean the ideas in here aren't good, though, and I enjoyed re-encountering many of these ideas. I think there was a few that were kind of new to me, but I mean, the basic thing here is we're just talking about make people feel important. People want to feel important. That's the basis of this whole book. That's, if there was one message from this, is make people feel important. It gets a little redundant, but I enjoyed the stories. But it did feel fluffy. No begrudging. It's worth a read. Pick up a copy if you haven't read it. Next, we have John A. Keel, The Man, the Myth, and the Ongoing Mysteries by Brent Raines. I can almost guarantee that most people have not heard of this book. This is one step above a self-published book. There's a lot of really strange typesetting in here. It could have used an editor. It's clear that Brent Raines he's an online writer. He's a blogger in the paranormal field. And because of that, the writing style is a little bit different. Just like I said, it could have used an editor to, number one, catch some of the typos, fix some of the typesetting that's just sometimes you're like, is that the title or is that just like a stray 4 words? But more than that, one mistake that he makes a bunch of times and is a little bit hard for the reader is he will, how do I say this? Stylistically, when you write a piece, especially nonfiction, when you mention someone, the first time you mention them, you give their full name, and then from that point on, you can refer to them by their last name, unless somebody else has the same last name. Like if you have James Jones, you can say James Jones, and then every time after that, you can just say Jones, unless there's a John Jones also. Then you have to keep, you got to keep people clear. The mistake he makes is he will tell you something about Jones, and the next page is about Jones, and the next page is about Jones, and for 4 or 5 pages, and you're going, who is Jones? And then finally on the 6th page, you'll say, oh, James Jones. That might seem like a minor thing, but it really derails the reader. It's kind of about John Keel. It's more about John Keel dealt with this idea, and then he goes off into the wilderness for a while on a tangent about that idea, what some other researchers say, and then all of a sudden, after many, many pages, come back and be like, oh, by the way, John Keel was very influential. To be honest, when you read books about the paranormal, it's kind of par for the course. I mean, this isn't literature. It's not highly structured. Most of these people publishing books like this don't even have editors. Like this has been published since 1936. It's been edited so many times that it's down to like a format. When you compare the two, this is more free, this is more raw, and this is more formulaic. Interesting ideas in here. Interesting ideas. If you know who John Keel is, you know what you're dealing with here. Okay, what do we have next? Let's do, this one was, can I say this one was my favorite? A lot of good books this batch, but this one had a very profound impact on me. This is In the Pursuit of Silence by George Prochnik. Basically, the book is about silence in the world, finding silence in our lives, but That makes it sound like a self-help book, and it's not. It's really investigative journalism. I don't know how many people he interviewed. I guess he probably went through hundreds of interviews to do this book. People who have large booming stereos in their cars, to people who sell audio equipment for your home to give you a home theater sound, to Buddhist monks, to Trappist monks. But the beginning and near the end were my favorite parts because they dealt with silence, and it came to me at a time when I needed this. I was dealing with so much noise in my head. And it's kind of, I think, what ends up being the message of the book is that the silence that we need to find, we can't expect to come from around us. We have to cultivate it in our environment, but also inside of ourselves. And the part at the beginning where he talked about the silence of Quaker meetings and the daily lives of the Trappist monks, as well as near the end where he talked about deaf people working with architects. So very, very well-researched book, excellent, wonderfully written book. I'm surprised I'd never heard of it before. Like I said, my favorite of this batch. Then I went back and reread something that I read many years ago, a lot because of In Pursuit of Silence. And this is The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains by Nicholas Carr. This is an older book. I want to say 2010? Yep, I nailed it. 2010. If you could see what Neil Postman's work did as an extension of Marshall McLuhan's work. So you go from understanding media and the medium is the message of McLuhan to Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. This would be Marshall McLuhan's grandchild and Neil Postman's child. Basically, the argument of amusing ourselves to death from Neil Postman is that television and our experience with television changed the way that we view the world and we interact with the world. And this book is about how we interact with the internet is actually changing the structure of our brain. Wonderful book. Like I said, I read this many years ago. I think I read it in like 2013, 14. Then actually, before we get to these, you might have noticed I said 7 books, but there's only 6 here. So what I do now is I read several hours in the morning, paper book, nonfiction. And then in the evening, when I walk the dog for about half hour to an hour, I listen to an audiobook of fiction. And I get the best of both worlds. So because of that, since I don't have a physical book of the fiction, I've printed out book covers so we can look at something physical. So the fiction book I read is this monstrosity. I printed out this sideways copy so you're going to see how thick this book is. This is A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. I started this book in 1994 in high school. Obviously, I did not finish it. And it was a big book, and I was a sophomore in high school. This was a lot. And I have another page here because I never finished the book, as I said. And then sometime years later, probably in my 20s or early 30s, I bought the mass market paperback copy because I no longer had the big doorstopper copy. And this is the copy that I bought in the mass market paperback book. And I never read that either. The thing about it is, I'm glad I didn't read it all those times because when I read it this time, I can't imagine a time in my life that it would have been more perfect to read this book. This book is incredible. It's incredible. It's incredible, especially when you consider he is not a religious or a spiritual man. I assume that means he's an atheist. And I think it's interesting that he wrote what I would consider, at least in fiction, the best book about faith that I've ever read. And I don't mean faith as in a specific faith. I mean the concept of faith itself. Tremendously powerful novel. So that's my fiction book in this batch. That's the only fiction book this batch. Then I went on to something, these aren't in order, but then I went on to something that I've been sitting on for a couple months. Cinema Speculation by Quentin Tarantino. One of the great filmmakers of our time, writing about film. And he is a film nerd. And this book shows it. And I discovered something through this book that maybe I'd forgotten or maybe just never realized. I never tire of reading about film. Ever. And then lastly, we have this book. It's Glass House by Brian Alexander. This was a really hard book to get through. Not because it's poorly written, but because emotionally, this was a hard book to read. Lancaster, Ohio in 1947, I think it was Forbes magazine called them, they said, this is America. Like they were the quintessential idea of what small town America could be. And since then, it's slowly and sadly gone downhill. This is the story of how that happened. It's also the story, in a way, in a microcosm, a way of telling the story of the death of American manufacturing. Money comes from out of town, buys companies, and moves the jobs away. Or buys companies, squeezes them so that they can get a quick turnaround. So they come in, they tell the people, the unions, you guys have to make less money, you have to make concessions. So they want to keep the factory because it employs a huge number of the town, and it raises the revenue of the company because they're spending less, and then they sell it. And then the next person comes in and does the same thing. The next investment firm comes in. They do the same. So every time, over years, when everybody else's wages are going up, in factories across America, wages are going down because they're being squeezed and strangled to death. And this is the story of how that happened in one town. And it's heartbreaking. So those are the 7 books that I read last. That's about it.